The kitchen smells like lard and wood smoke and something faintly sweet underneath it all. Rendered bone, maybe, or dried apple. It's 1931. The address is a cold water flat on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, 4th floor, no heat. A woman named Concetta Ferrara is standing at the stove with a pot she has used every day for 11 years. She is making something from a pig's head. Not because she read about it in a magazine. Not because a chef in a tasting menu restaurant suggested it was adventurous. Because it costs 14 cents and it will feed 7 people, and she has not been to a grocery store in 3 days because there is no money and the weather turned and the baby has a cough. What she is making has a name. What she knows about fat rendering, about salt ratios, about when to add the vinegar and when to pull back the heat. That knowledge took generations to accumulate. It lives in her hands. In 30 years, her granddaughter will stop making it. Not because it isn't worth making. Because a frozen dinner costs 69 cents, and nobody wants to be reminded of Mulberry Street anymore. 20 meals are on this list. Some of them were eaten by necessity. Some of them were eaten by choice, and the distinction says something important about who we decided to forget. Number 12 was declared a public health hazard by the city of Chicago in 1926. Number 7 was the daily meal of an entire social class that built the railroads and the bridges and the steel mills and got none of the credit. And number one is the meal that was in every American kitchen for 300 years before it vanished inside of a single decade. And its disappearance tells you almost everything you need to know about what we chose to become. The food wasn't lost because it was bad. It was lost because we were told it was shameful. And the people who told us that had something to sell. Number 20, head cheese. The pig's head comes off the hook and goes into the pot hole. Ears, snout, cheeks, the fatty tissue behind the jaw. In a butcher shop in Cincinnati in 1908, this would have cost you almost nothing. A nickel, maybe 8 cents. Because the assumption was that nobody with options wanted it. The assumption was wrong about the wanting, and it was completely wrong about the value. Head cheese is not cheese. It is a terrine made from the collagen-rich meat of the pig's skull, simmered for hours with bay leaves, black pepper, whole allspice, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar, then packed tightly into a mold and left to cool until the natural gelatin sets everything into a firm, sliceable loaf. The vinegar is not decoration. It does 2 things. It brightens the fat so the finished product doesn't taste greasy, and it acts as a mild preservative at a time when refrigeration was either absent or unreliable. The German and Eastern European immigrants who made this in American cities in the late 1800s understood preservation chemistry without ever calling it that. Then the meat inspection laws of the early 20th century arrived. Not bad laws, taken individually. The meatpacking industry had earned every bit of scrutiny it received. But the enforcement targeted small neighborhood butchers disproportionately, making the informal head-to-tail economy of the immigrant kitchen suddenly expensive to operate legally. The big processors could afford compliance. The man on the corner with his single pot could not. Head cheese retreated, first from the butcher shop window, then from the table, then from memory. Walk into a charcuterie in any major American city today and you will find it listed as fromage de tête, priced at $16 for 4 ounces and described as a Lyonnaise tradition. Concetta Ferrara's grandchildren would not recognize the accent. Number 19, Rumbledethumps, Scotland, 1870s. A farm worker's wife in Perthshire with a cast iron pan, a pile of cold-boiled potatoes from the night before, half a head of cabbage, a wedge of hard local cheddar, and enough butter to make it worth eating. The whole thing costs almost nothing. It takes 20 minutes. The farm worker will carry it to the field in a cloth-wrapped bundle and eat it cold at midday, and it will sustain him through 8 hours of work that a modern fitness tracker couldn't measure. Rumbledethumps, the name is probably onomatopoeia for the sound of mashing, is the Scottish cousin of Irish colcannon and English bubble and squeak. And all 3 are versions of the same idea, the cold starch and the brassica and the fat, combined by heat into something greater than the sum of its parts. The cabbage softens into the potato, the cheese melts into both, the butter carries the whole thing. It is complete nutrition for manual labor, and it requires almost no technique beyond patience and a willingness to leave it in the pan long enough to develop a crust. Number 18. Potlikker and cornbread. This is not a garnish. This is not a side dish. In the rural American South through the first half of the 20th century, potlikker, the dark mineral-rich liquid left in the pot after long braised greens, usually collards or mustard greens with a ham hock, was a primary food source for families who could not afford to waste anything a pot produced. The technique was intuitive and correct. Greens braised for 2 to 3 hours with a smoked ham hock leached their nutrients into the cooking water: iron, folate, vitamins A and K, calcium. The liquid that most people today pour down the sink contains more nutrition per cup than the greens themselves after they've been drained. Southern cooks knew to save it. They made a rough cornbread. Not the sweet cake version that appears at chain restaurants today, but a dense, unsweetened skillet bread made with stone ground meal, buttermilk, and lard. And they dunked it directly into the potlikker and ate the bread sodden and hot. Number 17. Lumber Camp Beanhole Beans, Northern Maine, January 1890. The temperature is 11 degrees. 40 men will wake before dawn and work a timber stand for 12 hours. The cook, always called the cookie, always one of the most respected men in camp, buried a cast iron pot in a pit lined with hot coals the night before and covered it with dirt and burlap. He has been asleep for 6 hours. The beans have not. Beanhole beans are exactly what the name says. Dried beans cooked in a covered pot in a hole in the ground, buried with hot coals or hardwood embers and left to cook overnight through retained heat. The method was adapted from Wabanaki and other northeastern native cooking traditions that lumber camp cooks encountered and absorbed, often without acknowledgement. The beans, usually navy or soldier beans, were seasoned with salt pork, molasses, dry mustard, and onion, and they emerged in the morning with a depth of flavor that 12 hours of stovetop cooking could not replicate. The molasses caramelized slowly against the iron. The salt pork rendered into the beans. The overnight cooking broke down the complex carbohydrates in ways that made the beans more digestible and the energy more sustained. Something the lumberjacks verified empirically every single day, because a meal that didn't hold you for 6 hours in a timber stand was not a meal worth making. Number 16. Scrapple, Philadelphia, 1850. A Pennsylvania Dutch butcher's wife with a pot of pork scraps, the trim, the liver, the heart, the head meat, everything left after the primal cuts were sold. Simmers it all down, strains out the solids, returns the broth to the pot, and adds cornmeal and buckwheat flour and enough sage and black pepper and marjoram to make the whole kitchen smell like a hymn. The mixture thickens. She pours it into a loaf pan and lets it set overnight. In the morning, she cuts it into half-inch slices and fries them in lard until the outside is deeply brown and crackling, and the inside is dense and savory and soft. Scrapple is the Pennsylvania Dutch answer to the question of what to do with a pig after the parts with names have been taken. It is a complete act of culinary engineering. The cornmeal provides the structure, the buckwheat provides the earthiness, the offal provides the protein and the fat and the iron. The spices manage the strong organ notes, so the finished product tastes of the seasoning and the crust and not of the slaughterhouse. It was consumed for breakfast by German and Swiss immigrant farmers from the late 1600s onward, and remains, in the corners of southeastern Pennsylvania and the Delaware Valley, a genuinely living food tradition. Here is the first thing worth saying plainly. None of these foods disappeared because they failed. They disappeared because the institutions that replaced them, the meatpacking corporations, the processed food industry, the federal agencies that regulated small producers out of existence while clearing the path for large ones, had the capital to outlast any tradition. The grandmother's recipe required her hands, her time, her accumulated knowledge, and a neighborhood infrastructure of butchers and farmers and neighbors who shared techniques. Industrial food required none of that. It required only a factory, a distribution network, and a marketing budget large enough to teach an entire country to be embarrassed by what it used to eat. The food didn't lose on merit, it lost on money. And everything on this list is a form of evidence. Number 15, Burgoo, Kentucky, late summer, any year between 1870 and 1940. a political rally, a county fair, a horse race, a homecoming, a cast iron cauldron the size of a small bathtub over an open wood fire, a man named Gus Jobber, or someone like him, the great Burgoo kings of Kentucky were their own tradition, stirring a mixture that has been building since yesterday morning. Burgoo is a slow-cooked stew with no fixed recipe and no fixed duration. What it requires is quantity and time. The base is whatever large animal is available, originally squirrel and wild game, later mutton, chicken, pork, and beef. Into the pot go dried field corn, lima beans, potatoes, tomatoes, okra, and whatever other vegetables the season provides. The stew cooks for anywhere from 6 to 24 hours, losing water to evaporation and gaining body from the rendered fat and the slow dissolution of the collagen in the meat. The stirring is constant. Walking away from a burgoo is not done. The finished product is thick enough to eat with a fork. The genius of burgoo is social. It is not a household dish. It is a community dish, made in quantities that require communal organization and consumed at events that require communal gathering. The cooking is the event is the cooking. When the suburb replaced the county fair and the backyard grill replaced the wood fire cauldron and the community gathering reorganized itself around individual households rather than shared space, burgoo lost its context. You cannot make burgoo for 4 people. The whole point of burgoo is that it cannot be made for 4 people. It persists in central Kentucky, especially around Owensboro, where a handful of restaurants and church fundraisers keep the tradition alive. Outside the state, it is almost entirely unknown, which says something specific about the relationship between food and place, and what happens to both when the place changes. Number 14. Slumgullion, mining camps, Colorado, 1878. The camp cook, frequently a failed prospector who discovered that feeding men paid more reliably than digging for gold, has a single large pot, dried beans, whatever tinned tomatoes came in on last week's supply wagon, and whatever scraps of beef or salt pork remain from the last slaughter. He combines them with onion, dried chili peppers, and enough fat to keep the whole thing from sticking to the pot, and he calls it Slumgullion, a name borrowed from a word for the watery waste fluid from whale processing that somehow migrated into general use as slang for any thin, disreputable stew. The name was deliberate self-deprecation. The miners called it Slumgullion and meant it affectionately, the same way sailors called their hardtack tooth dullers and railway workers called their camp coffee mud. The food was the food. Pretending otherwise was a form of dishonesty that hard-working men in hard conditions had no patience for. What Slumgullion actually was, when made by a skilled camp cook, was a deeply flavorful, long-cooked stew in the tradition of the chili bean combinations that Tejano and Mexican ranch cooks had been making in the Southwest for generations. Combinations that the Anglo mining camp absorbed and renamed without attribution. The tomato acidity tenderized the meat. The bean starch thickened the broth. The dried chili provided heat and complexity that the altitude and the cold made medicinal. Mark Twain wrote about eating Slumgullion in Nevada in 1861 and described it with specific, eloquent contempt that reads, given enough distance, as the contempt of a man who hadn't yet learned to cook. Number 13. Salt cod and pork scrunchions. Newfoundland, any Thursday in winter, 1920. Salt cod has been soaked for 36 hours in multiple changes of cold water. It is now tender, white, and faintly briny. Not the saltboard plank it arrived as, but something that has been transformed by time and water into a different food entirely. The salt has pulled out, the protein has rehydrated. The fish that was preserved in August is edible in February, which was the entire point. Into the pan go scrunchions. Small cubes of salt pork fatback, rendered slowly until they are golden and crisp and swimming in their own rendered fat. The salt cod goes into that fat with potatoes, boiled separately and added whole. And the finished dish is rich and saline and deeply satisfying in a way that only makes sense when you understand that the people eating it have been working on the North Atlantic in February and need every calorie the scrunchions contain. Salt cod built the North Atlantic economy. It fed the fishing communities of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New England, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, and the Caribbean for 400 years. The trade routes for salt cod financed empires, and the people at the bottom of those trade routes, the fishermen and their families who ate it as a daily staple, developed techniques for preparing it that transformed a preservation medium into a cuisine. Number 12. Chitterlings, Chicago, 1926. The city's Board of Health issued a report identifying chitterlings, the small intestines of the pig, cleaned and cooked, as a source of illness among the city's black population on the south side. The report recommended against their sale and consumption. The report did not mention that the same small intestine, prepared by trained sausage makers in German and Polish butcher shops on the north side, had been stuffed, smoked, and sold as a premium product for decades without a single Board of Health advisory. Chitterlings, universally called chitlins in the communities that ate them, had traveled from the plantation economy of the South to the urban kitchens of the Great Migration. They were a survival food first, the parts of the pig that enslavers distributed to enslaved people because they considered them worthless. The women who received them made them into something. The cleaning process was labor-intensive and specific. Multiple washes, careful removal of fat and tissue, extended boiling, a second boiling with aromatics, onion, garlic, bay leaf, sometimes apple cider vinegar, until the intestines were tender and the broth was rich. Served with hot sauce and white bread, eaten at New Year's for luck. There is a pattern in this list that is worth naming directly. The foods most aggressively targeted by regulatory bodies, public health campaigns, and mainstream cultural derision in the 19th and early 20th centuries were almost always the foods of the poorest communities, specifically the foods of Black, immigrant, and indigenous communities. The targeting was not random. The same preparation techniques that earned a German butcher a retail license earned a Black cook a health violation notice. The same organ meat that was celebrated as French haute cuisine was characterized as primitive when it appeared in a southern kitchen. Regulations are not neutral. They reflect the values of the people who write them. And in America for most of its history, those people had a very clear sense of whose food was worth protecting. Number 11. Pemmican, the Great Plains, pre-contact and for 3 centuries afterward. A Lakota or Cree woman pounds dried bison meat against a flat stone until it is fine and fibrous, like rough flour. She melts rendered bison fat, the back fat specifically for its clean flavor, and combines it with the powdered meat in a ratio of roughly 1:1 by weight. Into the mixture go dried chokecherries or Saskatoon berries, pounded along with their pits, which add tannins that extend shelf life. The whole thing is packed tightly into a bison stomach or a rawhide parfleche bag and sealed with fat. It will keep for years. It contains everything a human being needs to sustain hard physical activity in cold weather: fat, protein, carbohydrate, and enough vitamin C from the berries to prevent scurvy. Pemmican is perhaps the most nutritionally efficient portable food ever developed by any culture anywhere. Arctic explorers in the 19th century survived for months on it. The Hudson's Bay Company purchased it by the ton for fur trade expeditions. It was the energy bar of its era, and it was designed by the people whose land the traders were crossing, a fact that European accounts of the time generally omitted. Number 10. Potlikker dumplings, Tennessee, Appalachian foothills, 1940s. The pot of greens has been cooking since morning. By mid-afternoon, the potlikker is dark and rich and trembling with fat from the ham hock. A woman named Beulah, or dozens of women named something else entirely in dozens of kitchens, makes a simple drop dough: flour, baking powder, salt, enough buttermilk to hold it together. She drops it by spoonfuls directly into the simmering liquid and puts the lid on. 12 minutes. The dumplings absorb the broth as they cook, expanding into soft, savory clouds that are somehow both substantial and delicate at once. They have taken on the flavor of the greens and the smoke of the pork and the mineral depth of the pot. They are not a side dish. They are the meal. This technique, cooking a simple unleavened or leavened dough directly in broth, appears in cuisines across the world and across history. Every culture that had a pot and a grain eventually arrived at the dumpling. The Appalachian version used the most flavorful liquid in the kitchen and produced something genuinely extraordinary. The ingredients cost almost nothing. The skill required was real. The heat had to be right, the dough had to be mixed correctly, the lid had to stay on. It was not difficult, but it was not thoughtless either. Number 9. Vinegar pie. Midwest, 1880s through 1930s. Harvest is done. The root cellar has potatoes and turnips and jars of things put up in August. There is no fruit, there will be no fruit until May. A farmer's wife in central Illinois needs to make a pie because a pie is what you make when someone comes to visit. And the minister's coming on Sunday, and you have eggs and butter and sugar and vinegar and a reputation to maintain. Vinegar pie is a custard pie made from eggs, sugar, butter, a small amount of flour, and a generous pour of apple cider vinegar, usually 2 to 3 tablespoons for a standard 9-inch pie. The vinegar does for the filling what lemon juice does in a lemon curd. It cuts the sweetness, provides an acid brightness that makes the custard taste alive rather than merely sweet, and carries aromatic complexity. Baked properly, the filling is firm and translucent and faintly caramel at the edges, with a flavor that is both familiar and oddly surprising. Sweet, tangy, eggy, rich. It tastes of nothing else. The pie was made across the Midwest and into the South, wherever fresh fruit was unavailable for part of the year, which was everywhere. Recipe variations show up in handwritten cookbook manuscripts from Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, and Tennessee from the 1870s onward. Women passed the technique between households because it solved a genuine problem: the need for a celebratory food from minimal resources. Number 8. Corned beef and hay. New York City, Lower East Side, 1905. The Irish and Jewish immigrant communities that share the neighborhood have been trading food culture with each other for 15 years. Kosher butchers sell brisket cured in salt brine, beef that observant Jewish households make for the Sabbath. Irish immigrants, accustomed to salt pork at home but priced out of it here, discover that the brisket is cheaper than what the non-kosher butchers sell, and that it responds beautifully to the same preparation, boiled with cabbage, potatoes, and carrots. The dish that America calls Irish food, the signature meal of St. Patrick's Day, was invented in a Manhattan tenement by Irish immigrants cooking Jewish beef because they couldn't afford anything else. The hay in this entry is not literal hay. It is the term, borrowed from Irish slang, for the cabbage and braised greens that surrounded the beef in a traditional preparation. And the thing being mourned here is not the corned beef, which survived and was commodified and became a deli staple. What was lost is the specific cooking tradition. The long braise in a single pot with cabbage and turnips and potatoes all cooked together. The cooking liquid served as a broth before the meal, the second use of the braising liquid to make a pot of soup the following day. The whole system, not just the recipe. Number 7. Railroad gang rice and saltfish. Central California, 1869. The Chinese workers who built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad, approximately 10,000 men, fed themselves. The Central Pacific did not provide adequate food. What the company supplied was salt pork and beans in quantities insufficient for the work being done and unsuited to the cooking traditions of the men doing it. The workers organized their own supply chain. They had their own cooks, their own provisions, their own techniques imported directly from Guangdong province. The daily meal was rice, cooked correctly, which is to say washed, rested, and steamed with a precise water ratio, plus saltfish, dried oysters, mushrooms, bamboo shoots, and dried vegetables that arrived in barrels from San Francisco Chinatown, provisioned by merchants who understood that a 10,000-man workforce represented a substantial market. The food was more nutritious, better prepared, and more culturally sophisticated than anything the Anglo workers on the same crew were eating. The Chinese workers also got sick less often, which contemporary observers noted with confusion, attributing it to racial characteristics rather than the obvious cause, which was that the food was better and the drinking water was boiled for tea. This was not primitive food. It was a full regional cuisine operating at scale under extreme conditions. The cooks were skilled professionals. The supply chain was complex. None of it has ever been adequately documented or honored because the workers themselves were stripped of their right to citizenship, their right to land, their right to remain by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The food went with the community when the community was forced out. The descendants of these workers have spent 150 years trying to put the story back together. What all of these foods have in common is not poverty. Some of them were eaten by people with means, and some were eaten by people with none. What they have in common is craft. Every single dish on this list required specific knowledge. Knowledge about salt and thyme and heat and fat, about which part of the animal to use and why, about how to coax nutrition and flavor from ingredients that announced nothing. That knowledge lived in people, not in books. It was transmitted through observation and repetition in kitchens and campsites and field operations and fishing boats by women and men who never wrote it down because writing it down felt beside the point. The point was to feed people now, today, this generation. When the people were displaced or discouraged or told that their food was shameful or simply absorbed into a convenience culture that made the knowledge unnecessary, the knowledge went with them. We lost the food. We also lost the education. And we spent 50 years building a food system that produces abundance and malnutrition simultaneously, having thrown out everything that the grandmothers knew about making something from almost nothing. Number 6, lard bread. Naples and its diaspora, early 20th century. Every Italian-American bakery from Brooklyn to Chicago to San Francisco made some version of it. A dense, savory bread enriched with rendered lard and studded with cured pork, crackling, bits of salami, or whatever the pork butcher had that week. Baked in a round loaf until the crust was deeply brown and the interior was moist and almost meaty, perfumed with black pepper and sometimes a handful of dried chili flake. It was not a sandwich loaf. It was an event. You tore it apart with your hands at a table with other people. The technique goes back to the agricultural poor of Campania and Sicily, where lard was the fat available to households without olive oil. A paradox given what Italy meant to American cuisine, but accurate. The Southern Italian immigrant kitchen was not the olive oil kitchen of American culinary imagination. It was the lard kitchen, the preserved pork kitchen, the use every part kitchen. The lard enriched the gluten structure of the bread in ways that butter could not replicate, and shortening would only approximate badly. The rendered pork distributed fat and flavor unevenly through the crumb, so each slice tasted slightly different. This was not a flaw. This was the point. Number 5, Souse. The Caribbean, the American South, and every kitchen in between that inherited the pig whole and gave nothing back to the slaughterhouse. Souse is a pickled meat dish. Pork ears, feet, snout, and sometimes cheek meat. Simmered until tender with aromatics and then submerged in a brine of lime juice, pepper, cucumbers, onion, and sometimes hot peppers, and left to cure in that acid bath overnight. It is served cold, sliced with more lime and hot sauce and bread. The technique is straightforward, but the result is not. The long acid cure transforms the texture of the ears and feet, already gelatinous from their collagen content, into something tender and yielding with a faint resistance, bright with lime, sharp with pepper, layered in flavor in a way that is almost impossible to describe adequately to someone who hasn't eaten it. It is not a shy food, it announces itself. Souse traveled to the Caribbean with the enslaved people who were forced to process the parts of the animal that no one else wanted, and they made those parts into something that has sustained communities across the Atlantic world for 3 centuries. In Barbados, it is eaten on Saturdays. In Trinidad, the pork is replaced with chicken feet or cow heel in some households. In the American South, it appears under various names: souse, hog's head cheese, pork jelly, in every county with a significant Black or Caribbean population. Number 4, Silky chicken soup. New York City, Chinatown, 1950s. The Silky chicken, a breed with black skin, black bones, and dark, slightly gamey meat prized throughout East and Southeast Asian cooking for its medicinal properties. Simmered in a clay pot with wolfberries, dried jujubes, lotus seeds, goji, astragalus root, and ginger for 3 to 4 hours, until the broth was nearly black and dense with the extraction of everything the bird and the herbs contained. This soup was made for new mothers, for the recovering sick, for elderly grandparents in the winter, for anyone in the family who needed something the family understood as more than food. The concept is jing, a kind of nutritional vitality that traditional Chinese medicine associates with specific ingredients and specific preparations. The Silky chicken was valued not despite its unusual appearance, but because of what the darkness of its flesh indicated about its nutritional properties. Number 3, Appalachian ramp soup. West Virginia, March, any year before 1965 or so. The snow is still on the north slopes, and the first green thing pushing through the dead leaf mulch is the ramp. Allium tricoccum, wild leek, a plant so potent in sulfur compounds that a school in Fayette County, West Virginia, sent children home in 1930 because the whole building smelled of the ramps the students had eaten for breakfast. The school sent home a note asking that parents not feed their children ramps on school days. The parents largely ignored it. Ramp soup is simple. The whole plant, bulb, stem, and broadleaf, chopped and simmered in water or light pork broth with potatoes and sometimes dried beans. The flavor is somewhere between garlic and onion, but more intense than both, wild and green in a way that no cultivated allium replicates, because the ramp is eating the specific mineral composition of the Appalachian forest soil and translating it directly into flavor. The soup tastes of early spring in the mountains. It tastes of the specific place where it was made. This is what terroir means, stripped of the wine industry's price premium. The ramp was the first fresh green food available after a winter of root vegetables and preserved meat, and its sulfur compounds, its vitamins A and C, were genuinely medicinal in communities that had been subsisting for months on a diet that spring made urgent to correct. Mountain people understood this not as nutrition science, but as appetite. You wanted ramps in March the way you wanted water after working in the heat. The body knew what it needed. The communities that ate ramps are still there. The ramps are still there. But the annual ramp dinners that mark the end of winter in every hollow and county seat in Appalachia through the mid-20th century are attended by fewer people each spring, and the older women who knew 20 ways to cook them are running out of people who want to learn. The Charleston, West Virginia ramp dinner has been held since 1947. The last time it sold out was 1989. Meanwhile, ramps appear every April at farmers markets in New York City and San Francisco and Chicago at $24 a pound, sold to restaurant chefs who describe them as a seasonal discovery. Number 2, Haluski. Pittsburgh, 1952. A Slovak woman named Helen Mishkovsky has lived in the same house and homestead for 23 years. Her husband works at the Carnegie Steel Mill, 12-hour shifts, rotating between the open hearth furnace and the rolling mill. He comes home needing somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day, and arriving with too little energy to care much about what those calories look like. Helen makes haluski, egg noodles, wide and flat and slightly rough surface made by hand that morning, tossed with half a head of cabbage that has been shredded and fried in a full half cup of butter until it is golden at the edges and tender all the way through, seasoned with nothing more than salt and black pepper. It is almost nothing. It is also, when made correctly, astonishing. The rough texture of the hand-cut noodles against the silky cabbage. The richness of the butter carrying the natural sweetness of the cooked brassica. The whole thing sustaining and warm in a way that is specific to cold weather and hard work, and a house that smells like butter and flour. It is the food of the steel towns of western Pennsylvania and Ohio, brought from Central Europe by the Slovak, Czech, Hungarian, and Polish workers who built the mills. Number 1. Sunday dinner, not a single dish, a system. And the system is what we lost. Every major American immigrant and working class community had a version of it. The meal on Sunday that was different from every other meal of the week. Not because it was more expensive, though often it was slightly more expensive. Not because it was more elaborate, though it was. Because it was the meal that organized the week. You worked toward it and away from it. The pot roast that went in the oven Sunday morning would become soup Tuesday, sandwiches Wednesday, hash Friday. The chicken roasted on Sunday with herbs from the kitchen windowsill would yield a carcass that made the stock, that made the gravy, that made the beans, that made the bread. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be wasted, and the intelligence required to manage that system. To think forward 3 days, to know what the fat from Sunday's chicken would do on Thursday, to remember that the bread from last week's baking made the best stuffing, was a complete education in thermodynamics, nutrition, economics, and planning. Sunday dinner was also the meal where people sat down together, not at a kitchen island, not in front of a screen, not standing over the counter, at a table for an hour. With the food in the center and everyone arranged around it in an order that everyone understood and no one had to negotiate. The grandmother at the head in Polish households, the grandfather in Italian ones, the oldest uncle carving, the children watching and waiting and learning without knowing they were learning, how a meal worked and who they were in relation to the people around it. This sounds like nostalgia. It is not nostalgia. It is a specific record of what the convenience food industry, the accelerating work culture, the suburbanization of American life, and the collapse of multi-generational households took from people when they arrived. Sunday dinner did not disappear because people stopped wanting it. It disappeared because the conditions that made it possible, the time, the proximity of family, the infrastructure of a neighborhood where everything needed to make it was available within walking distance, were deliberately dismantled and replaced with something more profitable to other people. The pot roast recipe is still in the cookbook in your mother's cabinet, if there is still a cabinet, if the cookbook survived the last move. The technique still works. The ingredients still exist. What we lack is not the recipe. It is the week organized around it. The table understood as the center of the house. The grandmother who showed you without ever explaining it, how you use all of it and waste none of it, and how making something good out of what you have is not a limitation but a form of intelligence. Call her, if she is still there. If the recipe is still in her hands rather than only in her memory. Ask her to show you before it goes from a memory to a story to nothing at all. That is 20 meals that nobody makes anymore, or almost nobody, or not enough people to matter to the culture. What this list is really about is knowledge. The knowledge that lives in hands and not in heads, in practice and not in description, in the act of making and not in the watching. Every single dish on this list was kept alive by teaching, and it was lost by the cessation of teaching. And the cessation was never an accident. It was always the result of something. A regulation, a demolition, a corporate decision, a cultural contempt, a generation that was told its food was shameful and believed it because it was too tired or too young to argue. The food was not inferior. The people who made it were not primitive. They were skilled and they were solving problems, and the solutions they arrived at were often better. More nutritious, more efficient, more complete, more connected to the specific place and season and community that produced them than anything the convenience industry ever manufactured to replace them. The question worth sitting with after a list like this is not which dish you'd try. The question is, what is still alive in your family's kitchen that will not survive the next generation if you don't do something about it right now? Tell us in the comments what your family still makes that nobody else seems to know. Tell us what you think we should have put on this list. And if there is something your grandmother makes or made that you've been meaning to learn, go learn it. The window for that particular education is not as wide as it feels.